you have your Bibles handy, if you would, please turn to the 3rd chapter of Job. We'll continue our thoughts about this text that we began last week. As I discussed in the opening last week, a lot of times when you study the book of Job, we study the first 2 chapters and then we quit. Because we think the meat of the lesson about Job and about the trials that he underwent are in the first 2 chapters, but they really aren't. That's just the introduction. The meat of the lesson is found in the remaining chapters of this pretty long book. And we're going to truncate some of that this morning and draw it down. We're going to focus on, for good reason, God's response. We're going to see what God had to say to Job. Most of us are probably at least superficially familiar with what his friends had to say. We know a little bit about what he thought in regard to all of these trials, but we're going to concentrate for just a moment on what God has to say about all of this, because that's where the lesson lies. Job is a book that is universally applicable. Because if hard times have not found you, they're coming. In some form. Whether it's the loss of someone that you love and is dear to you, whether it's cancer, whether it's depression, whether it is separation from someone that you love, whether it is the spiritual condition of a child or a parent, or a brother or a sister, or whether it is discouragement for any number of reasons. Suffering is a universal sickness that mankind has to deal with. And so Job is universally applicable to all of us. Last week we saw what happened that sets the scene now for everybody beginning to chime in about where they feel Job is and what has caused this. And we made the point that it's not unusual for mankind to ask why. That seems to be, when something bad happens, the first question that we ask is why. And I have noticed in other applications in life, a lot of times if there's an accident, we ask why in the hopes to prevent it. That seems reasonable. You know, there is a reason that parents tell children as they learn to drive and they leave the house, buckle up. There is a reason we tell them, get off the road after a certain hour. There is a reason that we give them a cell phone. Now, they don't use it for that reason, but our reason for giving them that cell phone is so if they break down, they can get in touch with us. And so we recognize that sometimes we ask the important question, why, after a tragedy, in hopes to avoid it in the future. That doesn't seem to help in Job's situation. Because the truth of the matter is, at the conclusion of this lesson, we will discover Job never figured out why. God never told him. God explains his perspective, but he never tells Job the challenge that the text lists in chapter 1. Job doesn't know. Job doesn't know about the conversation between God and Satan and consider my servant Job. He doesn't consider God restraining Satan in 2 different challenges. Job doesn't know about that. And according to the text, there's no reason for us to believe that he ever found out about those things. And so the why was not answered. And yet it is in our nature to say, why? Why did this happen? Why me? Or why her? Or why him? Why did this happen to us? What did we do wrong? Where did I go wrong? What mistakes did I make? Now you're beginning to get into the mind of Job. And his 3 friends are going to do nothing but muddy the water, at least most of the time. And so let's think about in chapter 3, Job's mind. We're going to look at, he kind of divides this into 3 sections. In the first 10 verses, in effect, what Job does is says, I am so beside myself in suffering. Remember, Job has lost everything that is important to him. He lost his children. He lost his means to take care of himself. He lost his wealth. He lost his worldly possessions. Then he lost his health, and he is left only with a wife that has nothing but bad advice. And in the first 10 verses, Job literally curses even the night of his conception. Why was I even born? If it was going to turn out like this, why was I even conceived? Why am I even here? We're not going to study it today, but one of these days we'll return to this text and consider the same thing. But this is very similar language in the first 10 verses to the last verses of Jeremiah chapter 20. Jeremiah asked the same question. I've always, preachers get down from time to time. You don't have to spend much time with a bunch of preachers before you're going to find one of them who is going through that cycle of discouragement. And a lot of times we will appeal to Jeremiah chapter 20. And when I study the prophets, there's one thing that becomes crystal clear. It doesn't work out well on this earth for any of them. You would look at almost every one of the prophets of the Old Testament, and if you measured it from the barometer of success that we normally put to success, we would say every one of them were abject failures. None of them seemed to accomplish what God sent them to go do. At least we would judge it that way. You look at the prophets and you say, here are men who just beat their head against the wall trying to convince God's people to straighten up and come back to God and repent and relent from sin, and it was just miserable for them. Elijah sits underneath the terebinth tree in the Negev and just bemoans that I am the only one left, Lord. He was wrong about that, by the way. But I am the only one left who is faithful to you. And I'm just, Lord, I'm done. Jeremiah felt the same way. Jeremiah felt like Job. My life, my ministry, my responsibility and my mission, Lord, is so difficult, and I'm coming up with failure time and time again that I wish I had never been born. You ever been there? That's where Job is at the conclusion of these challenges. It would have been better off in the long run if I'm going to suffer like this. And let me point out, with no end in sight for the suffering. Now, let me point something else. We need to get inside of Job's mind. Last week I had a dental exam, and I'm going to tell you something. There's not many things in life that make me nervous. I've done a lot of adventurous. I'm kind of an adrenaline junkie, so I've done a lot of that kind of thing, jumping out of airplanes and all that kind of stuff. And that never made me really all that nervous. But when I go to the dentist, my knees buckle when I walk back to that little room and that noise. And that's just almost more than I can take. So I had a dental exam the other day, and the whole time I'm laying there in the chair, and it can all come out good, by the way, and I got home and I told Sharon I got a good report of the dentist. She said, you're welcome, because she enforces oral hygiene around our place. And she's serious about it too. She doesn't joke about it. She will sometimes, she will remind Jed, son, don't forget to brush your teeth. Mothers never stop being mothers. I don't get it. But anyway, I was laying there the whole time with the little thing, and I'm hanging on white knuckled and I'm thinking it'll be over in just a minute. There's an end to my suffering. Now, it really wasn't all that bad, but there is an end to this in sight. I know that in just a few more minutes, she goes through the bottom, she got to go through the top. Those are the only teeth I got. When it gets to that done, I'm done. I can get up and I can leave. Job didn't know that. Job didn't know that. There was a big joke amongst me and my friends in 1990. My unit was deployed to Desert Shield and Desert Storm within just a matter of weeks of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And back then, now soldiers go on a deployment and they start counting down days. You know how long you're going to be there. You're going to be there 365 days. You're going to be there 12 months. And you can start counting down. You know what? There's some sanity to that. There was no end. When we got there, they told us to be prepared to be there from 1 year to 3 years. And so we counted up. It was kind of a joke. We didn't count down. We counted up. And ended up being there not as long as I don't think everybody is expected. But Job didn't have an end in sight to this suffering. There's no telling. He doesn't know. It could be 1 day, it could be 10 days, it could be a year, it could be forever till his life ended. We understand why he begins to feel it'd be better off if I had never been born. And so he begins to question along that line of thinking. He says, well, why didn't I just die at birth? If this is where I was going to come to anyway, wouldn't it have been better if I had just been stillborn? Notice that Job looks at death as an escape from suffering. And we hear that all the time, but we need to be very cautious about that concept, because that is only a relief for the righteous. That's only a relief for the people of God. I heard a nurse walk out of a man's, and I'm not judging people. All I know about this guy is what I knew about him, and I knew that he was a terribly ungodly man. And the nurse walked out of the room moments after he died and said, well, finally he's at peace. And I remember I kept my mouth shut, but that's not the time. Too late then. But I can remember thinking to myself, I don't know about that. He constantly rejected God through his life. Death is a relief for the righteous. It's something that only brings relief to those who have that hope. And I believe that Job recognized that. And then he goes on into some other questions. Kind of the bigger picture. Well, why are the suffering allowed to linger, Lord? And Job finally ends that chapter 3 feeling that there's no possible relief in sight. And we find out something about Job there in the latter part of chapter 3, that this is what Job has feared the most. All of us have different kinds of fears, and some of them may be rational, other people may say they're irrational. I'm all the time talking, people will talk about, I'll tell them, well, that's kind of an irrational fear. Look, it's not to that person who holds that fear. It's not to that individual. It's not an irrational fear. And so we all have things that worry us. I've got them, you've got them. There are things that we think in the back of our mind, that's the worst case scenario. That's what I hope that Job says that. He says, in effect, what I have feared the most in life has come true. My worst case scenario, the thing that kept me awake at night, has now become a reality. Job's in bad shape. But most of us can probably sympathize. Some of these thoughts have probably gone through all of our minds. And that's the reason that this is such an important text for us. Now, we're going to skip dozens of chapters. But let me tell you quickly what happens in those chapters. Beginning in chapter 4, his 3 friends show up. And they've got the answer. And here's the short version. Not been that long ago that we studied this in greater detail. I think it was on Wednesday night. But here's the short version. The short version is, Job, you've done something wrong, and you're not admitting it. Because God wouldn't treat a just man like this. God wouldn't treat a man who had done nothing sinful like this. So apparently you've done something wrong, and either you don't know about it or you're unwilling to admit it. There are 3 rounds of speeches, 9 total, And Job responds between each one. And Job's response is, I don't know what it is, but it's not that. It's not the fact that I have done something unrighteous. I've not done something unrighteous. Remember how God describes him. Now we are going to look at one individual. There is a lot of folks don't realize this. There is a fourth person who comes on the scene in chapter 33. If you go to chapter 33, please. So Job's three friends, if we think of it in these terms, Job's three friends consider this punitive. You've done something wrong and therefore God has punished you. A young man by the name of Elihu in chapter 33 comes online. He kind of speaks last and says, I'm a young man and that's the reason I've waited while the older men chew on this, but now let me chime in. And we're not going to read all of this, but there are some certain things that we need to point out. Elihu has a different perspective. The other three friends have basically said, you're being punished. This is punitive in nature. You've done something wrong, and God has punished you. Elihu looks at it a little bit differently. Elihu suggests that it's not punitive, but it is disciplinary. So in verse 8 he says of chapter 33, surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sounds of your words, saying, I am pure without transgression, I am innocent, and there is no iniquity in me, yet he finds occasion against me, he counts me as his enemy, he puts my feet in the stocks, he watches all my paths. Look, in this you are not righteous. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him? For he does not give an accounting of any of his words. For God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. Notice verse 19. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed and with strong pain in many of his bones. Elihu suggests something in all of this that we recognize. That there is the possibility here, Job, that you're not being punished for something that you have done in the past. There is the possibility that there is some unknown reason that you are being challenged, that you are being disciplined, that you are being taught a lesson. Later, Elihu uses this great statement. He tells Job to be still and consider God's way. Now here's another interesting thing we find out about. We're going to go to God's response now. But I want to point this out. This young man by the name of Elihu, when it's all said and done, in the final chapter, God is evaluating everybody's advice. And he said to the three friends, you're wrong. In this case, we'll point something else out about this in just a moment. But he says, in Job's case, you're wrong. It wasn't punishment for something that he had done. And they repented. But he never does that with Elihu. That's interesting to me. I think that's telling. Is that to Elihu, in that last chapter, when God's evaluating the advice and the counsel of these three friends, of Elihu, he doesn't say anything, which would at least suggest to us he didn't say anything wrong. Because God seems to correct the other three. And he doesn't do that with Elihu. Which again seems to me to suggest Elihu's onto something. That, okay, Job, maybe it's not for something that you have done that has been wrong, but maybe there are other reasons that you've not yet considered because you've been picking your brain, trying to figure out why God did this to you. Maybe you just need to be quiet, be still, and see what you can learn from this. That was Elihu's advice. And then in chapter 38, if you'll turn over to chapter 38, God begins to speak to Job. This is a long section, and for the sake of time, we're not going to read all of it, but I want you to notice how God begins to frame his argumentation. Because generally, this goes on. Now, God is going to give, we will say, two speeches, and he allows Job to respond. But God is going to now weigh in on His idea. And in chapter 38 and verse 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now this is, I think, important. Because now we've been going back and forth with a lot of advice, and most of us have probably been there, where we're, this person's saying this and another person's saying that, and if you feel like you're being accused, you're like, wait a minute, it can't be that because I didn't do that. I think Job really is. I think this may be one of the cases where Job starts in chapter 3 in that soliloquy thinking it can't get any worse, and then his 3 friends show up and make it worse. Because they're giving advice that is only adding to his anxiety, because he's saying, I've not done anything sinful, which is true. He said, I've not done anything that would make God punish me. I don't think Job sets itself up as complete perfection and sinless, but he is blameless. And so now, God is still not going to give Job an answer. But he is going to explain some things. He's going to change Job's way of thinking. Notice how he does this, beginning in verse 2. He starts with he goes through this whole section with a series of questions. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Right up front. Words without knowledge. You guys have just been talking to each other. You've darkened counsel. You've really shed no light on any of this. We use the phrase, his statement brought a lot of heat but no light. And I think that's God's point at the beginning of this. And then he goes on. He says, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. So now, God in effect is saying, you're not going to question me anymore. We're going to reverse roles here. I'm going to question you, and you can provide the answers to me. So here's the first question. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Job? Friends? Elihu? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you around that? Were you able to assist in that? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I think there's one in particular, I think even we see almost a sense of humor in verse 6, for instance. To what were its foundations fastened? Come on, guys. You can tell. You know the answer. No, they don't. That's the point. In verse 8, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther. And here your proud waves must stop. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? Notice verse 16. Have you entered the springs of the sea, or have you walked in search of the depths? Verse 19. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place? Verse 22. Have you entered the treasury of snow, or have you seen the treasury of hail? Verse 25. Who has divided a channel for the overwhelming water, or a path for the thunderbolt? Verse 31. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades? I think I pronounced that right. Bernie? What is it? Pleiades. Okay. Great to have an astronomer in the audience. Or loose the belt of Orion. Verse 39, or chapter 39, verse 1. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Or can you mark when the deer gives birth? And God goes on in this line of thinking. Verse 26 of chapter 39. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom? Verse 27. Does the eagle mount up at your command? God appeals to creation. He appeals to the natural world. Something we are all familiar with. Chapter 40 in verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. When Job, and so God's first discourse, when in this first speech, he makes this introductory rebuke and this challenge. And then he goes on and poses questions for Job. This is God now referring to Job, saying, Job, have you ever done that? Can you tell me where the bolts are that fasten the universe to its foundation? Can you tell me how to stop a wave in a particular place? Can you tell me the date of the birth of a deer? Can you tell me, can you make the eagle mount up? Can you do that, Job? Nope, you can't. And so God makes a challenge in verse 2. Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Now, let me point something out. I do not think that God suggests that we should not ask questions. I don't think that's the point here. I don't think God is trying to convince Job that he should just ignore evidence and just blindly follow God because he is God. But what I do believe God is trying to convince Job of is there is evidence, and based on that evidence, you've asked too many questions. You should have trusted deeper in my wisdom that this was not just arbitrary. There was something to this. I would protect you in this. I would bless you in this. I would care for you in this. Doesn't suggest Job has sinned. Remember, he is challenged. We're not going to put Job in a position where Satan was right. That's not the conclusion here. What I do believe God is saying to Job is, you're chasing the wrong rabbit down the wrong hole. You're looking at this wrong. There are other possibilities that you can't even begin to fathom. Now, he doesn't give the answer. This would be the point as a father when I would say to Junior, now, let me tell you, son, why I did that. God doesn't do that. God, the ultimate question, the ultimate lesson that God is trying to convince Job of, and those of us who would take this to heart is, sometimes you're not going to know the why, and therefore you're going to trust God anyway. Not blindly, but based on what you know about the wisdom and the power and the sovereignty of God. When God appeals to proof of his wisdom and his power, he appeals to something that everyone can be familiar with, and that is the natural world around us. Pretty awesome. There's one particular place that every time somebody would come to visit us in Alaska, we would take them. If we had an opportunity, we took them to Mount McKinley, Denali. That's pretty impressive. If you can get there on one of the 25 days a year that you can see it, but still pretty impressive. I'll have to admit when you do get to see it. But there was a place on the highway that we used to take the folks, and we would pull off, and it was this wonderful. You could see the Matanuska River below and mountains in the background. And I could not go to this place. There's a lot of places in Alaska like this, by the way. But I could not go to this place and comment to myself sometimes, God had a great day when he made this place. It is just unbelievable. And God appeals to those kinds of things. To the ocean, to the skies, to the rain, to creation. Were you there? Did you put the stars in place? Do you know how, Joe, do you know how that works? Not only do I know how that works, I invented it. I created it. I made it. Don't question me. You don't need to know why. And God doesn't explain to him the why. This is Job's response at the conclusion of God's first speech. I would argue he gets it right. He says, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Job says, Lord, from this point on out, I'm just going to shut up and take it like a man. I've got no right to question the why. Because, Lord, you're correct. You are sovereign. You are powerful. And I knew that all along, and I should have never gone down this road. In the next chapter, there is a second challenge to Job. More questions along the same line, dealing with nature, but in some cases a little bit more specific. If you'll notice chapter 40 and verse 8, he said, God challenging Job, he says, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? In other words, would you set this on me so you can be right? In chapter 41 and verse 11, who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. And now in chapter 42, beginning in verse 1, Job answers the Lord. In verse 2, he says, I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of you can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand. And I think this is the point where Job is starting to learn. This is where his faith is being expanded. This is where he's coming to deeper knowledge of the lessons of God. He says, I have uttered what I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You say, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Lord, I have heard it before, but now I get it. Now there is clarity. Now I see. I should never have questioned you. I should never have tried to figure this out. I should have known there is a lesson in this suffering somewhere for me. The rest of the chapter in the book here in chapter 42 conclude the story of Job. It talks about God's response to his three friends. It talks about the doubling of Job's blessing and the restoration of Job at the hands of God. And it talks about the fact that he lived 140 more years and watched his family grow 4 more generations. So there are questions here that we probably, I think, all understand. Number one, is suffering always a sign of God's wrath? Now let me point something out that we can't fail to miss. Sometimes the answer is yes in Bible history. Sometimes suffering is trying to teach us a lesson. It is a direct result of something that we've done. The captivity of Israel, taken into captivity, both the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivity on the part of that was wrought out on Judah, those things were meant as punishment. God was punishing those people for turning their back on him. So there was a direct result between the affliction and the action. Peter reminds us of that. When Peter instructs us, I'm paraphrasing, but don't brag when you suffer because of your sin. You're getting what you deserve. Don't try to act like you're suffering because you're a Christian. You're suffering because you're a sinner. So that's a valuable question. Do we have a right to question God about why he does the things or allow the things that he allows? Job would suggest if we're going to do that, we better tread cautiously. It's not that we can't contend with God. Numerous times, he says to his people of old, come and let us reason together. But what is there between the lines is not so we can convince God that we're right, but so that he can convince us that he is. And so we need to approach this cautiously. But deep down inside, this is a lesson about why people serve God. That was where Satan kind of started this second challenge. Let me back up. It's where Satan started the first challenge. You put a hedge around him. And if you take that hedge away, if he's not blessed any more, That's the only reason he served. So Job is not just a book about suffering, it's also a book about motivation for service to God. Do I serve God because I love God, or do I serve God because so far life's been pretty good for me when I have served God? And if life doesn't continue to be pretty good for me and my motivation goes, we were talking about this morning in the juniors class, you know what? People will stay for the reason that you brought them. Whatever you draw them in, you draw them in with money, you draw them in with food, you draw them in with good times, you draw them in with entertainment, guess how long they're going to stay? They're going to stay as long as that lasts. If people are serving God because of the blessings God gives them, they're going to serve God as long as the blessings stick around. Our motivation is to serve God out of love. Here are some points of application I would ask you to take with you. Job remained faithful in his devotion to God even when he didn't understand what was happening. Now, he learned some lessons along the way. There is no doubt. But the text does not suggest that his character changed and Satan won the day. That's certainly not the case. Human wisdom is not often wisdom at all. Be careful. You know, one of the great lessons that I try to instill with my children is if we ever reach a crossroads where you don't want to take my advice, please be careful where you take that advice from. Because there's all kinds of people out there willing to give you bad advice. And I'm not suggesting even malicious. But human wisdom is not always wise. Because it's not nuanced by the Word of God. It's not structured by the Word of God in many cases. And finally, God is sovereign. I think that was the great lesson that Job, I will put my hand over my mouth. Lord, I'm not going to ask these questions anymore. Job is a challenging text. Sometimes it's difficult to discern everything that the three friends are saying. For instance, what was wise and what was not. Because after all, God does punish people for their sins. We see that in the Old Testament in particular. Elijah is also something of an enigma. God neither commends nor condemns what Elihu had to say. There are times in Elihu's speech that he agrees with the three friends. Job, you brought this on yourself. But Elihu seems to focus on Job's suffering as disciplinary, not punitive. In other words, God's trying to teach you a lesson. You're just not getting it. And Elihu's admonition in the text to stand still for a moment, quit trying to figure this out and look at it from a different perspective, may demonstrate him, Elihu, as a transition between the poor advice of the friends and the perfect advice and counsel of God. We need to serve God in adversity because He is worthy of such, even apart from His blessing. We need to take caution in comforting the afflicted. We cannot fully comprehend God's wisdom. I want to leave you with this text. In the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk was one of the minor prophets, a prophet to Judah in its kind of death throes, in the very last days of Judah. And Habakkuk didn't have much more success than any of the other prophets in doing what he was charged with doing. But he concludes his discussion with these words. In chapter 3 and verse 17. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the field yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet. He will make me walk on my high hills. Habakkuk is saying, I don't care what happens in life. The crops may fail. Things may fall apart. But I will put my strength and I will put my courage and I will put my joy in God. Because God's in charge. God is sovereign. God is worthy of worship when the blessings disappear. That we do not worship God out of convenience because everything's going so well. But we dig down and find even deeper meaning in our understanding and our relationship with God when times are at their darkest. When we are at our most vulnerable, when we are going through the most difficult parts of our life, is when there is the potential for the greatest growth. Where Job finally says, I will put my hand over my mouth, and I will look for the lesson in this word. I don't understand. Job never got the answer. We can, I think, assume that Job went to his grave not knowing the answer. And yet, he accepted the wisdom of God. And that's the challenge that faces us. This morning, if you have not accepted the comfort that comes in salvation, the comfort that comes with knowing God, with knowing the hope of eternal salvation, knowing a relationship with your Creator, today you can begin that. You can begin that walk by obeying the gospel of Christ. If you're here and subject in any way, we ask that you come. I will stand while we stand. Thy glory, our Savior.